Hello, everyone. So, this is going to be the second half of our two-part lecture. The first lecture, of course, being on Spanish conquest of Mexico. This is the second half of that lecture because, of course, Spanish conquest did not end at Mexico. It continued into the American Southwest. And particularly, this Spanish conquest led into Colorado's own San Luis Valley. However, at the time, this was not considered Colorado, and we'll talk about some of the hands in which ownership of this state has transferred over the years. So, to go ahead and begin this lecture, the San Luis Valley in Colorado, it's in southern Colorado connecting into New Mexico. It is culturally New Mexican, and that is because of the Spanish colonial influence there. Um, it's also an area that's historically very isolated. So, as a result of it being historically isolated, it's kind of developed its own unique cuisine, its own unique way of speaking Spanish as well. The Spanish of the valley and parts of northern New Mexico actually relate more to the dialect of Cervantes than modern Spanish. Also, there are some very unique views on family and faith within the New Mexico San Luis Valley area. And people of Mexican descent and Spanish descent often call themselves Mexicanos or Hispanos. And this is separate from a lot of other Latinos. Latinos more of a broad spectrum, large umbrella term. Hispanos is specific to this region and is specific to the unique offspring that was created from Spanish colonials and Native Americans. So that is a very specific term that we'll use kind of interchangeably with Mexicanos throughout this lecture. Also, in this area, there exists a very rich and dynamic history that is often glossed over when talking about the American Southwest. So prior to the founding of Santa Fe by the Spanish in 1607, there weren't any Europeans in the American Southwest, with the exception of a few French trappers. The only people that were in the American Southwest were Native Americans, Native Americans like the Cheyenne and Arapaho that we discussed last week. It wasn't until the Spanish founded the seat of the Spanish crown in Santa Fe in 1607 that there began to introduce an influence of white Europeans to the region. And as a result, Santa Fe is the second oldest European city in the U.S. And located just north of Santa Fe is Colorado's own San Luis Valley. However, at the time of Spanish settlement, the San Luis Valley and most of Colorado was not seen as suitable for colonialization due to the lack of usable water and hostile Indians, particularly the Utes. Now, some of the individuals who were early explorers of Colorado and the San Luis Valley include first Don Diego de Vargas in 1694. He has the first written account of Colorado's San Luis Valley and discusses buffalo herds there. Then you have Juan Batista de Anza in 1779. And that's followed by Zebulon Pike of Pikes Peak in 1807. We'll discuss him at length in just a minute here. And finally, from about 1821 to 1822, you had Jacob Fowler. He was a fur trader from Arkansas, and he entered the San Luis Valley through La Vita Pass, which is on the Pueblo side of the Sangre de Cristos. He entered there in February 4th, 1822, and his journal is a wealth of information concerning the environment and interaction between the various tribal peoples who occupied the San Luis Valley. And then by late 1600, due to Spanish settlement in New Mexico, incursions into Colorado's San Luis Valley were prevalent enough that it begins to affect the everyday lives of native people. And By affecting the native lives, I mean that seeing Europeans became something that was noticed on a regular basis, and more importantly, it affected the grazing grounds and the buffalo herds, which directly impacted native people's food sources. So, one of the people that I had mentioned who was an early Spanish explorer in parts of modern day southern Colorado was Juan Bautista de Anza in 1779. Now, originally, de Anza left New Mexico, where he was the governor, to quell Comanche raids on Spanish settlements in parts of modern day Colorado. He chased bands of natives down Poncha Pass over to the Arkansas River into what is modern day Salida, then crossing over into Cripple Creek and into modern day Colorado Springs, where a battle was fought. And this battle served to secure the San Luis Valley from Comanche raids for a brief period of time. Now, specifically, what happened was by 1779, the Comanches were such a problem that the New Mexico governor, De Anza, assembled a force of about 600 men to track down the powerful Comanche chief Greenhorn to stop these raids for good. De Anza also enlisted the help of about 200 Ute and Apache allies who really proved to be instrumental in being able to track down Chief Greenhorn. Originally, De Anza marched from Santa Fe into what is modern day San Luis Valley with what was the largest Spanish force ever gathered in the North American interior at the time. De Anza engaged in battle with Chief Greenhorn on September 3rd, 1779, and Chief Greenhorn was actually killed in the battle. And during the course of this battle, his band of Comanches were resoundingly defeated by the Spanish. And in this middle photograph here, you'll see a monument that is located near Pueblo, Colorado. And it reads, "The cruel scourge was defeated and killed by the Spaniards under Governor Juan de Anza on September 3rd, 1779. The nearby mountain and stream take nicknames from the chief. De Anza was the first expedition through certain parts of Colorado." And then in the bottom photograph, you can see Poncha Pass. This is the pass where you cross over the mountains from Colorado Springs into the San Luis Valley. It's often driven. It's an area that people drive through often to go rafting and get into Salida. But that was a natural mountain pass that was used by Don. Now, another person I mentioned that many of you might have heard of, who was also a early explorer of parts of Colorado, was of course Zebulon Pike, who we named our Great Mountain Pikes Peak after. And we named the mountain after him, even though he did fail to climb it. But in 1807, Zeb Pike and his men traveled into parts of southern Colorado in order to map and describe parts of the southern portions of the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase. He entered the modern day San Luis Valley near the Great Sand Dunes that you see pictured on your right. Now, as he was traveling through Medano Pass, which connects kind of modern day Walsenburg into the San Luis Valley, traveling over the mountains, passing right by the sand dunes, Pike and his men were actually arrested by Spanish troops. And they were arrested for actually trespassing on Spanish land. Pike and his men were then transported back to Santa Fe, where he actually had to explain himself to the Spanish crown on why he was trespassing and what he was doing there. The Spanish governor, after hearing this explanation, allowed his mission to continue, and he traveled back to where the modern day sand dunes are, where he built a small fort that has been reconstructed today. You see it in your bottom right hand corner. And he finally reached the site of where the modern day city of Pueblo is located. From that location, he could clearly see Pikes Peak, which was referred to as the Great Mountain, And he famously told his troops that we should be able to make it to the top of the mountain in about 1 day. Now, mind you, this is from modern day Pueblo, Colorado. Of course, he did not make it anywhere near the top of the mountain, and his troops had to turn back in failure. But nonetheless, we did decide to name our great mountain Pikes Peak after Zeb Pikes' failed trek to climb it. Now, one thing I'd like to point out when we're discussing the American Southwest, particularly focusing on modern day Colorado, is just how often this territory has historically changed hands. And just to kind of give you an idea, you can see a list here, and I'll also show you some maps of just how this territory has shifted over time. But initially, till about 1810, modern day Colorado and much of the southern North American continent was controlled by the Spanish Viceroyalty of New Spain, essentially the Spanish crown. After Mexican independence, much of the American Southwest was then taken over by Mexico, who was a newly independent country at the time. Then, for a brief period in about 1837, portions of Colorado actually belonged to the Republic of Texas. The Republic of Texas being the famous situation involving Davy Crockett and the Alamo. This was a brief period from 1836 to 1845, but nonetheless, Texas was its own country and it included much of southern Colorado as well. In about 1850, Texas actually surrendered its claim to southern Colorado, which is the modern San Luis Valley. And controversy over the admittance of new states as free versus slave. And as a result of the Compromise of 1850, Texas actually surrendered its claim to New Mexico and the New Mexico Territory, including the San Luis Valley. And then in 1854, much of Colorado was actually considered Kansas Territory. Now, Kansas Territory was established out of previously unorganized lands from the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, in 1861, Colorado becomes a territory. In 1876, Colorado is granted statehood, and then in now, as I mentioned before, when the Spanish crown established Santa Fe as the capital of the Southwest, much of the land to the north in modern day southern Colorado or the San Luis Valley was considered unlivable due to lack of water resources and frequent raids from bands of Indians. So when Mexico was granted independence, land grants were issued in order to incentivize settlers to live on these southern Colorado lands and protect them from Indian raids. These new land grants were intended, like I said, to encourage Mexican settlement and to establish boundaries that dissuaded any thought of Texas returning to claim the territory as they did during independence, and also discouraging encroachments from American fur traders. The first of these grants was the Conejos Grant in 1842, and it consisted of about 2.5 million acres. The second grant was the Sangre de Cristo Grant, named after the Sangre de Cristo mountain range, and this was east of the Rio Grande River. And the idea behind these land grants was that if we have citizens occupying this territory, then that occupation equaled ownership. Now, these land grants largely did their job incentivizing settlers to come to the region and build long term roots there. But it was really the discovery of precious metal and minerals that brought large populations of settlers into the Southwest region. And that brings us to the Civil War in the Southwest. Now, during the Civil War, which was not long after the issue of the land grants, there existed a considerable community of Southern supporters throughout several mining communities in southern Colorado and throughout the Southwest. One of these notable gangs of Confederate sympathizers in Colorado was actually called the Reynolds Gang, and they were a group of about 15 Confederate cavalrymen who conducted raids and robberies in modern day South Park, Colorado. Now, during the Civil War, Southern forces, the Confederate Army, was actually eyeing Colorado's gold fields as a source for the Confederacy's ailing economy. And it should also be noted that slavery was not completely uncommon in southern Colorado, or what would become Colorado, particularly in places like the San Luis Valley. Um, the slavery of Navajo and Apache natives they were often enslaved after capture, and this tradition was largely New Mexican slash Spanish in origin and dated back to the mid 1700s when capturing raiding natives became booty for the Spanish soldiers. So I just like to note in 1865, when the Civil War was kind of breaking out, there existed about 153 slaves just in southern Colorado's San Luis Valley alone. So I like to always point out that the American Civil War was not just regional to the East Coast and the South. It also took place. And in 1862, a Civil War battle actually took place in the American Southwest. During the Battle of Glorieta Pass, Confederate forces led by General Henry Sibley pushed north, capturing both Albuquerque and Santa Fe in an effort to take over the landline between Texas and California and tap the Rocky Mountain mineral frontier on behalf of the Confederate Treasury. At Glorieta Pass, just 20 miles from Santa Fe in the Sangre de Cristo mountain range, Union forces met Sibley and thoroughly routed the Confederates, sending them back to the south. Later called the Gettysburg of the West, this stopped the invasion and, like I mentioned, sent the Confederates back into Texas and later back into the American South, and they did not return to the American Southwest. And this is an artistic depiction of the Battle of Glorieta Pass by Roy Anderson. Now, I mentioned earlier how the Hispano or Mexicano culture of the American Southwest was very culturally isolated. And as a result, this created a lot of unique customs, cuisine, way of speaking, and also a unique take on the Catholic religion. Now, the church was the primary influence during the initial exploration of the region. Members of church orders often were part of early Spanish expeditions. The church was instrumental not only in matters of faith, but also as educators, trade coordinators, keepers of public record, and builders. During the 19th century, around the 1850s, agricultural migration increased. Think about how these land grants took place and it incentivized settlers to settle in previously unrecognized lands, such as the San Luis Valley. And due to this increase in agricultural migration, priests often no longer accompanied parties settling in the American Southwest. So as a result, particularly in Colorado's own San Luis Valley and northern New Mexico, there emerged a unique order of brothers called Los Hermanos Penitentes. And they were regular citizens who took it upon themselves to maintain the Catholic faith in the absence of priests. These penitentes, or lay brothers, they actually punished themselves for their sins through self-flagellation by hitting themselves on the back or on the belly with like a cat of nine tails or a whip. The penitentes often met in buildings called moradas that were generally secretly built and maintained. In the Southwest, penitentes still survive and still practice their religion today. And many moradas are found in Conejos, Costilla, Alamosa, in Saguache County, as well as throughout northern New Mexico. And many of them, such as the one pictured here in La Garita, Colorado, are still in use today. And to kind of expand on that last picture, showing the La Garita mission in La Garita, Colorado, in the San Luis Valley, there also exists a very large rosary walk in front of it. This rosary walk features very large frescoes done in the traditional style depicting the Stations of the Cross. So if you guys are ever in the area, not only is there great fishing and some great camping, there's also a great opportunity to check out some artwork. And also located in the San Luis Valley and named after the penitentes is Penitente Canyon, located in La Garita as well. Penitente Canyon is known for some world-class rock climbing and is a must-stop destination for rock climbing enthusiasts. Also, if you know where to look in the area, there exist many petroglyphs from Native American cultures. Now, also an important part of the American Southwest and Spanish or Hispano culture is kind of a unique look on family life, which is cornerstone to the entire culture. There exist deeply rooted traditions among Mexicano families or Hispano families within northern New Mexico in the San Luis Valley. During the first Spanish expeditions into New Mexico in 1598, the colony included 400 men, 130 of whom had wives and children. So, as a result, this created many family units that came out of the American Southwest. Also in the American Southwest, particularly in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, the extended family has been a strong bond of cultural continuity. And after World War II, the educational opportunities of legislation such as the GI Bill actually allowed for many young men to experience new ideas and leave their communities for the first time and seek a better life for their family. For many families in Colorado's San Luis Valley and northern New Mexico, the roots of civil rights actually lie in military service and New Deal politics. After World War II, there existed a post war entitlement. And this was a sense of people of color, particularly in the Southwest, particularly of Mexicano or Hispano descent. They looked at it as after serving equally in an international war, they felt that they deserved equal treatment at home for the first time. And this helped to usher in an era of civil rights. However, as time went on, migrant laborers were continued to be paid low wages in the American Southwest and given no benefits for their family. Their children were not placed in public schools and oftentimes lived in shacks that were very primitive at best. And for many residents of the Southwest, particularly in southern Colorado, a clear-cut racial discrimination was really a way of life. And as a result, many residents of Hispano descent in the San Luis Valley and northern New Mexico became involved and the Chicano movement, which really broke out in the late 1960s and has deep roots within Colorado. And we'll be talking more about the Chicano movement and its influence in the American Southwest in one of our next few lectures.